All right, how are we doing today? Welcome to the channel, and this is an educational channel where we learn about all kinds of different theories of everything, other theories that you like to know about because they can affect your life in positive ways, but you probably haven't heard of them because they're relatively obscure and only a person like me who does a lot of digging would have encountered them. Many times they've been scrubbed or ignored, um, and the powers that be don't want you to know about some of this stuff. Today is video number 268 that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory. And this theory was originated by Dewey B. Larson, and he started his work on this way back in about 1930 and kept at it until his death in 1990. About halfway through, he published his fundamental postulates, two fundamental postulates, from which he derived or deduced his entire theoretical universe that he published in many different books that he wrote and articles on subjects from chemistry to astronomy to physics to metaphysics to economics, ethics, and it's a great body of work, monumental accomplishments. Doesn't mean he got everything right. He made some mistakes, in my opinion, and some of those mistakes were actually corrected by a person named Dr. Bruce Perret, who published something that he called RS2, the re-evaluation of the reciprocal system, or reciprocal system 2. And Dr. Perret also did a magnificent and monumental job of putting together his revisions, because they're not just wild, you know, let me do this here, I'll do this, you know, I didn't like how he did this, so I'm going to do this. He had a thorough best in the world, amongst the best in the world, understanding of the reciprocal system as it was before he started to make revisions. Okay, Dr. Perret knew the reciprocal system. And then he started to see a few holes in it, a few mistakes. And these are mistakes that Larson himself admitted that were possible. Larson believed that his theory itself was correct, but that his application of the theory in a deductive manner was subject to error. And that he didn't worry about that because he knew that eventually those errors were going to become apparent and that somebody would come along and correct them. And that's pretty much what happened. Now, Perret does speculate, admittedly, on his kind of extensions of the reciprocal system into other fields that Larson didn't discuss. And when he does that, he generally writes under the pen name Daniel Phoenix 3. And we're looking at one of those papers today that is called Extra-Dimensional and Extraterrestrial Entities. I very much doubt that Mr. Larson would have written on such a subject. And Dr. Perret certainly brings a number of other ways of thinking to the table when he writes this paper. It's not strictly reciprocal system derived, but it shows how the reciprocal system works and how you can apply it yourself. And that's what the beauty of one of the beautiful things about the reciprocal system is that once you understand it, then you can use it. It's not just a static kind of thing. It's something that you can apply. The basic gist of the reciprocal system is that this is really coming from his first and most important postulate, is that the universe is not made out of matter, and the universe is not even made out of energy, but the universe is made out of motion. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time. Now, that seems abstract, but it's pretty concrete when you think about it. What kind of motion do you know about? Um, what are examples of motion? Well, probably the first thing that you would think of is speed. Speed is motion. And how is speed measured? Speed is measured in, generally, you can use different units, but generally it's measured like miles per hour. The bike is moving 20 miles per hour. 20 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space divided by time. That is speed. Now, so the primary example that we can think of, it is actually a relationship between space and time. Motion is actually a relationship between space and time. But Larson says that applies to all kinds of motion, and that all of our basic scientific quantities are kinds of motion, such as, well, acceleration, space over time to the second power, force, time over space to the second power, energy, time over space. It took me 3 hours to move that thing 20 feet. That would be energy. Matter, time to the third power or space to the third power. Pressure, time over space to the fourth power. And many, many other relationships. Permittivity, permeability, magnetic flux, electric charge, electric current, density, viscosity, fluidity. These are all motions, forms of motion. And so Larson is on relatively firm footing there, and especially because you can take these these space and time fractions. Basically, motion is a fraction with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. And you can multiply them out in looking over all the formulas of legacy science. Plug them right in. For example, you start out with E equals mc squared. Okay, energy equals matter times the speed of light to the second power. Well, energy, we just said, is time over space. Matter is time to the third power over space to the third power. C, the speed of light, that's speed, s over t. The speed of light squared is s squared over t squared. So we have t over s equals t to the third power over s to the third power times s to the second power over t to the second power. So the equation works out. You can do that with all kinds of other theories, legacy science theories as well. And you don't have to then mess around with MKS units where you've got, meter, kilogram, seconds. You can just get rid of the kilograms. Kilograms are boiled down into space and time units. Time to the third power over space to the third power is matter, is mass. And so get rid of the K part of the MKS, you know, and so you're with meters and seconds. Well, that's a lot easier to deal with. Okay, now that is just the first part of Larson's theory. That motion is the constituent of the universe, and speed and time and space are the reciprocal aspects of motion. So basically, space and time are the contents of the universe, not the container of the universe. But there are caveats, and one that's been hinted at already is that time and space have their coordinate aspects, meaning that they have 3 or 4 dimensions. X, Y, Z coordinates in the case of space, and as we'll see a little bit more, and even in this paper that we're looking at here, the time coordinates are more like I, J, K, the imaginary numbers, which really ultimately boil down to 90-degree rotations. So you think of perpendicular 90-degree rotations. If you think of X, Y, Z are I, J, K, the imaginary numbers, as your coordinates. So, you know, really, from our vantage point, space is measured in straight lines, and time is measured in angle, you know, the rotation. But if we went, if we were in a different part of the galaxy, different part of the universe, it might be different. It might be reversed. But anyway, time and space both have multiple dimensions, 3 or more, 3 or 4, and Larson would just say 3. And Larson calls that coordinate time and coordinate space. Then he also says that space and time also have their clock aspects, and that means that he's referring to a scalar motion. This is a motion that has a magnitude, but it has no direction. And space and time, scalar motion is a fundamental part of the reciprocal system that's practically ignored by legacy science. But it's easy to envision with a balloon with a bunch of dots on it. If you blow up the balloon, all of the dots are moving away from each other, but in no particular direction, or really in all directions. And if you suck in the balloon, then all of the dots are moving toward each other. This is a scalar motion of space, what you would call the progression of space, or the flow of space. And we're much more familiar with the progression of time, the flow of time. That is, that time is always getting later and later and later and later. That is a motion of time in no particular direction. That is a motion in no particular direction, a scalar motion. And so too with space. Space is always getting farther and farther and farther apart. And in spite of it not being discussed by legacy science too much, this was actually observed by the Hubble telescope, in that it observed that all of the distant galaxies are moving away from each other. That is the flow of space. So that is the second one of the caveats of the first postulate. The third is that space and time are in discrete units only. There is no continuity. That space and time come in chunks. There is a minimum unit of space, and there is a minimum unit of time. If you don't have a full unit of space, then you do not have any space. You either have 0 or you have 1. And then you either have 1 or you have 2. And then you either have 2 or you have 3. You do not have fractional units, decimal units, And if you have exactly 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, then you have the speed of light. So for Larson, the speed of light is what he calls unit speed. 1/1 equals 1. And 1 in the reciprocal system is the center point. So for Larson, 1 is divides the universe into 2 separate sectors. One is the boundary, unit speed, the speed of light is the boundary. And there's a half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light that he calls the cosmic sector, and half of the universe that's moving slower than the speed of light, which is what we're more accustomed to, that he calls the material sector. And you can think of this in terms of the reciprocal system again. It's a multiplicative system with 1 in the center. So if you think of the normal legacy science, 0 is the center. And on the positive end, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. On the negative end, you have -1, -2, -3, -4, and -5. But in a reciprocal system, you have 1 at the center. And on the positive end, you have 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And on the negative side, you have 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, and 1/6. Okay, so you have 1 over an integer. And the negative infinity would actually be 0. Okay, now those are the 3 basic caveats of this universe is made out of motion, and motion is the relationship between space and time. And then the second postulate is just simply that the universe conforms to the relationships of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. Dr. Perret actually took him to task about the Euclidean geometry part and proposes in his RS2 that the geometry of the universe is projective. And projective geometry is actually an umbrella term that also includes Euclidean geometry. So there's basically a cascade, the two-way cascade, where the geometry moves from the most inclusive to a more exclusive, going from projective geometry to affine geometry to metric geometry, and then to Euclidean geometry. And there may be even another geometry in between there as well. But so that is a minor change that Dr. Perret also made. Not minor, but more minor than some of the other ones. Okay, now we're going to start here. This is, I believe, the 6th installment of the reading of Dr. Perret's paper here on the extra-dimensional and extraterrestrial entities. And this section is called Muggles Meet Albert Einstein. And Perret uses the term Muggles a lot. I believe it's from Harry Potter, and it just basically means somebody that doesn't know anything about occultism, doesn't know anything about magic or esotericism or any of the kind of non-obvious sciences that are out there. Okay, Muggles meet Albert Einstein. In the ice cube situation, a person with little or no psionic skill suddenly hears voices in their head, thoughts that are not their own, and a wild mix of emotions that have no correspondence in what you should be feeling at the time. Okay, if you just remember, what he's referring to is a situation where a person with very little psionic skill, or a muggle, a person who doesn't really have any psychic ability, goes into a room full of psychics, full of people that do have psychic ability. This, he says, it raises the ionization level, and so that person is flooded with all of this psychic ability that they don't really know what to do with because they're not accustomed to it. So in the ice cube situation, a person with little or no psionic skill suddenly hears voices in their head, thoughts that are not their own, and a wild mix of emotions that have no correspondence to what you should be feeling at the time. This normally results in a state of panic, and if the exposure is not removed very quickly, schizophrenia or insanity might set in from the sudden breaking down of barriers in the psyche. Interestingly enough, most of what a muggle experiences is not a transmission from the telepathic species encountered per se, but the contents of their own psyche that can now jump the barriers the ego has spent years erecting. Those repressed contents suddenly realize that they can be heard, want their say, and do it like a screaming child. The floodwaters of consciousness just got too high, went over the dams, and there you are, face to face with your darkest truths, as well as having to deal with a scary alien standing right in front of you. Many telepathic species are well aware of this situation and will normally not engage a non-telepathic entity in a group situation, simply as an act of compassion and understanding. Historically, when the LMs, or little men, kind of the mythical creatures of Earth, were interacting with humans and a human started to have this reaction, they would immediately release them and depart, as to not cause psychosis. For the most part, the Nak are a decent species, though for centuries they considered the aggressive Homo sapiens as more of a rabid dog than a fellow traveler. And just as we domesticate dogs, the LMs also domesticated some humans, usually seamen, whom they would snatch off boats mid-ocean, leaving an empty ship floating around. But those sailors ended up having a pretty good life with the LMs, traveling the cosmos on the arcs with a greatly extended lifespan. Okay, this section is called Albert Einstein Meets the Nox. And the Nox is NOx. And I believe they are kind of a takeoff of the Nok, which is NOKK. Okay, let me just look at some of these footnotes here. Larson generalizes the use of ionization, having three terms: thermal, electric, and magnetic. And that's, what goes up your psychic magnetic ionization. And then he says that, Harry Potter, in the Harry Potter books, a muggle is a non-magical person used in this context as a third density human with no psychic ability. And, he refers to arcs. Arcs are basically spaceships, but they are self-contained biospheres, motherships, of substantial size, constructed from asteroids and small planetoids. Okay, now this section is called Albert Einstein Meets the Nox. The other situation arising from putting the kettle on is when a telepathic species encounters a person with an inherently strong or consciously developed psychic ability. That person will actually overwhelm the social memory complex of the telepathic species. In this situation, the human psychological barriers tend to stay in place, but the floodwaters of consciousness spill out of the mind and across the telepathic landscape of the social memory complex. Most telepathic species, like the LMs, adapt quickly to this, and it gives them quite the high from all that extra bioenergy entering the complex. When this occurs, both parties experience a wonderful exchange of energy and information while retaining their identities. But, like all good things, when the bioenergy finally dissipates, there is the inevitable hangover. For the person interacting, their bioenergy, their chi, prana, will be severely depleted, and they will feel depressed and burnt out, sometimes for weeks after the encounter. Okay, now this section is called physical and emotional responses. Those scenarios address the basic communication issues with the telepathic species. There is also a physical challenge, as we are not accustomed to the sights, sounds, and aromas of drastically different life forms. And if you check your legends on the fairy folk, they are very human looking to start with some subtle difference. The Nak, for example, have the physical stature of a human child, 8 to 10 years of age, but have the skin of someone much older. It creates a contradiction within the psyche that has a reaction much like seasickness. When your eyes say the boat is still, contradicting your inner ear saying you're moving. Unconsciously, something does not add up, and you get a little nauseous because you are used to people with that stature having young skin, clean hair, and a smile, and not having bluish green, dolphin-like skin with pointy barracuda-like teeth. If you saw that thumbing for a lift on the highway, you'll hit the gas and speed away, despite them being a peaceful, philosophical people and wonderful conversationalists. Humanity has a lot of built-in prejudices that we need to overcome, and most people aren't aware of them until something brings them to the forefront. However, this can be overcome by strength of will and not looking away. When encountering alien species, you need to do so full sensory. That way your mind can build an internal model of what they are supposed to look like, smell like, and sound like. You need to add them to your internal database. Once that happens, then you are able to recognize them in the future, and the impact becomes less and less severe until there is no impact at all. And there will be an emotional reaction as well. Usually starts out as fear, sometimes to the point of panic, with the fight or flight mechanism kicking in. This is where intellectual development comes into play, as you can reason yourself out of fear by changing that fear into intellectual curiosity. Fear pushes apart, while curiosity brings things together in rapport and understanding. The difference between "what's that" and "oh, I wonder what that is." Something else to understand that most people get their emotional cues from body language. When encountering a body that you've never seen before, you will fall back on human body language, what you know, which can be totally wrong when non-human species are involved. If you smile at a furry blue creature from Alpha Centauri, he may interpret that showing of teeth as a growl and assume you are going to eat him for lunch. First encounters can be very sensitive, so you cannot take anything for granted, and you had better understand what you are taking for granted. These are situations that arise when encountering a friendly telepathic species. Encounters between non-telepaths only have to deal with the physical and emotional issues, which are usually resolved quickly. The remaining situation is what happens when you encounter a hostile telepathic species. And so this next section is called Mankind Meets Godzilla. Hostile species, such as the SMs, or Saurian men, which includes the Anunnaki, are fully aware of the situations described during our LM encounter scenario. Many are also telepathic and share a common goal, but that goal may well be subjugation rather than the search for enlightenment. Good predators take advantage of situations, so they make use of telepathic ionization, physical shock, and emotional stress to press their advantage. Not much can be done to guard against the fear brought on by slit eyes and a forked tongue. Man has had an adversarial relationship with reptilians for some time, and for good reason. It is a kind of race memory, if you will, that warns us of danger when certain extraterrestrial species are present that Homo sapiens has encountered before. Not all saurians are bad guys. Saurians basically, short for dinosaurians. Not all saurians are bad guys, but in their involvement with Earth has tended toward controversy in the past. Even if humanity removes the SM influence from Earth, we will encounter them as we move out into the galaxy, so it doesn't hurt to be prepared. Okay, now the next section is called Defense Against the Dark Arts. And rule number 1, you cannot defend against the unknown. Now we will start that when we resume tomorrow on this paper, and we'll go from there. From rule 1, he has a few different rules. Rule 2, never forget your Hoffman lenses. Rule 3, intelligence controls instinct. And yeah, so we will go through at least those 3 then tomorrow. But for the meanwhile, thank you for tuning in today, and have a beautiful day.